The dust kicked up around Gwendolyn Zimmerman's boots as she drove the plow blade deeper into the hard earth, her hands raw and bleeding beneath the worn leather gloves that had once belonged to her husband. The Montana sun beat down mercilessly on her shoulders in the summer of 1882, and the mule pulling the plow was as stubborn as the land itself, fighting her with every step across the 20 acres that stood between survival and losing everything she had left. She had been at it since dawn, and now with the sun climbing toward its peak, she wondered if Thomas had known just how impossible this life would be for her alone when fever had taken him 6 months ago, leaving her with a farm, a mortgage to the bank, and a determination that burned hotter than the prairie wind. The mule suddenly lurched to the right, nearly pulling Gwendolyn off her feet, and she cursed under her breath as the plow blade caught on a rock and twisted at an angle that would take her an hour to fix if she was lucky. She released the handles and moved to calm the animal, speaking low and soft despite her frustration, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the direction of the main road. Her hand instinctively went to the rifle she kept propped against the fence post 50 feet away, but she was too far to reach it before the rider came into view. He sat tall in the saddle on a paint horse that looked like it had traveled many miles, his hat pulled low against the sun, and he slowed his mount to a walk as he approached the fence line. Gwendolyn straightened her back and wiped the sweat from her forehead with her sleeve, leaving a streak of dirt across her brow. She was 24 years old and had been a widow for half a year, and she had learned quickly that a woman alone attracted all manner of attention, not all of it welcome. "Morning, madam," the stranger called out, his voice carrying easily across the field. He touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers in a gesture of respect. "Looks like you are having some trouble with your equipment there." "I can manage," Gwendolyn replied, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that made her bones ache. She could see him better now as he moved closer. He was young, perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that curled at his collar and eyes that were a startling shade of blue even from a distance. His clothes were dusty from travel, but his saddle was well made, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who knew his way around hard work. "I do not doubt that you can, madam, but there is no shame in accepting help when it is offered freely." He dismounted in one smooth motion and tied his horse to the fence rail. "Name is Xavier Patterson. I have been riding from Wyoming looking for work, and I would be happy to take a look at that plow if you would permit it. No charge, no obligation, just one traveler helping another." Gwendolyn studied him for a long moment, weighing her options. She needed the help desperately, but she had learned caution in the month since Thomas died. Still, something in the man's straightforward manner and the way he kept a respectful distance even as he offered assistance made her nod slowly. "Gwendolyn Zimmerman," she said. "And I suppose I would be a fool to turn down a free pair of hands, seeing as how I have been at this since sunup and have barely covered 2 acres. Xavier's face broke into a genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Well then, Mrs. Zimmerman, let us see what we can do about that." He climbed over the fence with practiced ease and walked across the turned earth to where the plow sat at its awkward angle. Gwendolyn watched as he knelt down and examined the blade, his hands moving with the sureness of someone who had spent his life working with tools and machinery. He asked her a few questions about what had happened, and she found herself explaining about the rock and the mule's sudden movement. His questions were intelligent, and his attention focused entirely on the problem at hand rather than on her, which was a refreshing change from the way most men in town looked at her these days. "The blade is bent but not broken," Xavier said after a thorough inspection. "If you have a hammer and something to use as an anvil, I can straighten it out enough to get you through the rest of this field. It will need proper repair at a blacksmith eventually, but this will do for now." "The barn," Gwendolyn said, pointing toward the weathered structure that stood 100 yards from the house. "There are tools in there. I will show you." They walked together in silence, the mule following docilely behind Xavier as though sensing a firmer hand on its lead. Gwendolyn found herself studying him from the corner of her eye, noting the way his shoulders filled out his shirt, and the easy rhythm of his gait. It had been so long since she had allowed herself to notice such things about a man, and the realization made heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the summer sun. The barn was cooler by several degrees, and Gwendolyn breathed in the familiar sense of hay and leather and old wood. Xavier found the tools he needed quickly, as though he could sense where they would be kept, and he set to work on the plow blade with efficient movements. Gwendolyn fetched water from the well and brought it to him in a tin cup, which he accepted with a grateful nod. "You have been working this place alone?" Xavier asked as he hammered at the bent metal, his voice raised just enough to be heard over the ringing strikes. "Since my husband passed in January," Gwendolyn replied. She leaned against a support beam and allowed herself a moment's rest, her muscles grateful for the respite. Fever took him in the span of 3 days. One moment he was fine, the next he was burning up, and then he was gone. "I am sorry for your loss." Xavier paused in his work to look at her directly, and there was genuine sympathy in his eyes. "It is not an easy thing, losing someone like that." "No, it is not." Gwendolyn surprised herself by continuing, "But the bank does not care about my grief. The mortgage comes due whether I am widowed or not, and if I cannot get this land planted and bring in a crop, I will lose everything." Xavier nodded slowly and returned to his work. They fell into a comfortable silence broken only by the rhythmic sound of metal on metal. When he finally held up the blade and examined it from several angles, he seemed satisfied with the result. "That should hold," he said. "Let us get it back on the plow and see how it does." They worked together to reattach the blade, and Gwendolyn found that Xavier did not treat her like a fragile thing to be protected from the heavier work. He asked her to hold pieces steady and to hand him tools, working alongside her as though she were any other farmhand. It was a strange feeling, being treated as an equal partner in the work, and she found that she liked it. With the plow repaired, Xavier took the reins from her hands without asking permission and guided the mule back into position. "Let me run a few rows," he said. "Make sure the repair holds before you take over again." Gwendolyn wanted to protest that she could manage, that she did not need a stranger doing her work for her, but the truth was that her hands were bleeding through her gloves, and her back felt like it might break if she bent over those handles one more time. So she nodded and stepped back, watching as Xavier set his feet and drove the blade into the earth. He moved with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years behind a plow, his body finding the rhythm of the work as naturally as breathing. The mule, sensing a stronger hand at the reins, pulled steadily without the balking and fighting it had given Gwendolyn all morning. She watched as he completed one row, then another, the dark earth turning over in neat furrows that would be ready for planting. By the time the sun had moved another hour across the sky, Xavier had covered more ground than Gwendolyn had managed in the entire morning. When he finally stopped and straightened his back, there was sweat soaking through his shirt, but he was grinning. "She plows true now," he said, patting the mule's flank affectionately. "You should be able to finish this field in a few more days if the weather holds." "A few days?" Gwendolyn shook her head. "At the rate I was going, it would have taken me 2 weeks at least." "Then perhaps you could use an extra pair of hands for those few days." Xavier pulled off his hat and ran his fingers through his sweat-dampened hair. I told you I was looking for work, and it seems to me that you could use someone who knows his way around a farm. I am not asking for much, just meals and a place to sleep in the barn. Once your field is planted, I will move on." Gwendolyn felt her throat tighten at the offer. Pride warred with practicality, and she thought of the mortgage payment due in 3 months' time, of the seed that needed to be in the ground soon if it was to have any chance of producing a crop before autumn. She thought of her bleeding hands and her aching back and the sheer impossibility of doing all this work alone. "I cannot pay you anything beyond food and shelter," she said finally. "I do not have money to spare. I did not ask for money." Xavier settled his hat back on his head. "I asked for honest work and a place to rest my head at night. If you can provide that, then we have an agreement." "Then I suppose we do." Gwendolyn extended her hand and Xavier shook it firmly. His palm was calloused and warm, and the simple human contact after months of being alone sent an unexpected jolt through her. She pulled her hand back quickly and turned toward the house. "I will make us something to eat. You must be hungry after that work." The house was small but tidy. 2 rooms downstairs and a sleeping loft above that Gwendolyn had not been able to bring herself to use since Thomas died. She slept in the bed they had shared, though she kept to one side as though he might still return to claim his place beside her. The kitchen was at the back of the main room, with a cast-iron stove that she stoked back to life while Xavier washed up at the pump outside. She made biscuits and gravy with the last of the sausage she had put up in the spring, and she scrambled eggs from the hens that scratched in the yard. It was more food than she usually allowed herself for a midday meal, but she reasoned that Xavier had earned it with his work. When he came inside, his hair was wet from washing and his face clean of trail dust, and she noticed for the first time the strong line of his jaw and the way his eyes seemed to take in everything about the room without judgment. They ate in silence at first, the food disappearing quickly from both their plates. Gwendolyn had forgotten what it was like to cook for someone other than herself, to see appreciation for her efforts in the way Xavier cleaned his plate and accepted seconds when she offered them. "You are a good cook, Mrs. Zimmerman," Xavier said, wiping his mouth with the cloth napkin she had provided. "It has been a long time since I had a proper meal at a table." "Where is your family?" Gwendolyn asked, then worried that she had been too forward with the question. "Forgive me, that is not my business. It is a fair question, seeing as how I will be staying on your property." Xavier leaned back in his chair and a shadow crossed his face. "My father died when I was 15. He was a ranch foreman down in Colorado and a horse rolled on him. My mother tried to keep things going for a while, but without his wages, we could not make ends meet. She remarried a man who did not want another man's son underfoot, even a boy of 16. So I left and have been making my own way ever since. That must have been difficult." Gwendolyn thought of her own family, long dead from cholera when she was just 18, and how she had met Thomas at a church social shortly after. He had been 10 years her senior, steady and kind, and she had married him thinking that was what love was supposed to feel like. It was only in the quiet months after his death that she had begun to wonder if there might have been something more, some spark or passion that she had never experienced. "It taught me to rely on myself," Xavier said, "and it taught me the value of honest work and fair dealing. A man's word should mean something, and when I tell you I will help you get this field planted, I mean to see it through." They cleaned up the meal together, and Gwendolyn showed Xavier where he could store his gear in the barn and where the cleanest hay was for making a bed. He seemed satisfied with the arrangements, and by the time the sun had begun its descent toward the western horizon, he was back in the field with the plow, working steadily while Gwendolyn tended to her other chores. She fed the chickens and collected their eggs, milked the cow that gave barely enough for her own needs, and weeded the kitchen garden that provided most of her vegetables. All the while, she found her gaze drawn back to the figure in the field, watching the way Xavier moved with tireless energy, covering ground that would have taken her days to accomplish. That evening, she made a supper of stew with vegetables from the garden and the rabbit that Xavier had shot while walking the fence line. They ate together again, and this time the silence felt more comfortable, as though they were settling into an easy rhythm of coexistence. After the meal, Xavier insisted on helping her wash the dishes, and they stood side by side at the basin while the last light faded from the sky. "I will be up at dawn," Xavier said as he dried the last plate and set it on the shelf. "If the weather holds, I should be able to finish plowing by tomorrow afternoon. Then we can get started on the planting." "I have seed wheat stored in the barn," Gwendolyn said, "and I have some money set aside for supplies if we need anything from town. Columbus is the nearest town." Xavier asked, and Gwendolyn nodded. Columbus, Montana was 8 miles to the south, a growing settlement that served the scattered farms and ranches in the area. "I go in once a month for supplies and to check if there is any mail." Gwendolyn dried her hands on her apron. "The people there know I am alone, and most of them have been kind enough, though there are some who seem to think a widow should not be trying to run a farm by herself. People often have opinions about things that are none of their concern," Xavier said quietly. "You strike me as a woman who knows her own mind and does not need others telling her what she should or should not do. I am glad someone sees it that way." Gwendolyn felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her with such simple respect, without pity or judgment or ulterior motives. That night, Gwendolyn lay in her bed and listened to the familiar sounds of the farm settling into darkness. But there was something new now, the knowledge that someone else was nearby, sleeping in the barn just across the yard. It was a comfort she had not realized she had been missing, the simple presence of another person sharing the space and the work and the silence. The next morning dawned clear and hot, and true to his word, Xavier was up before sunrise and already working in the field by the time Gwendolyn emerged from the house with coffee and leftover biscuits for his breakfast. He accepted them gratefully and ate standing up, unwilling to waste time when there was work to be done. Gwendolyn spent the morning preparing for the planting, organizing the seed wheat and checking the equipment they would need. She also took time to wash her only other dress and hang it to dry in the sun, feeling suddenly self-conscious about her appearance in a way she had not bothered with for months. She told herself it was foolish, that Xavier was just a drifter who would move on as soon as the work was done. But she found herself braiding her hair with more care than usual and pinching her cheeks to bring color to them. By mid-afternoon, Xavier had finished plowing the entire field, and he came to find her with dirt under his fingernails and satisfaction in his eyes. "The land is ready," he said. "We can start planting first thing tomorrow if you are agreeable." "I am more than agreeable," Gwendolyn replied. "I cannot thank you enough for what you have done. This would have taken me weeks on my own." "Then it is a good thing you are not on your own anymore." Xavier said it casually, but something in his tone made Gwendolyn look at him more closely. There was a warmth in his gaze that had not been there before, or perhaps she simply had not noticed it until now. They worked side by side for the next 4 days, walking the rows and broadcasting the seed wheat in the age-old pattern that farmers had used for generations. It was back-breaking work, but somehow with Xavier beside her, it felt less like a burden and more like a shared purpose. They fell into an easy rhythm, moving down the rows in tandem and they talked as they worked about everything and nothing. Xavier told her stories about his years of wandering, working on ranches from Texas to Wyoming, learning every aspect of cattle ranching and farming from men who were willing to teach a boy eager to learn. He spoke of sleeping under the stars and eating beans from a can, and the fierce independence of a life lived on the road. Gwendolyn told him about growing up in Ohio, about losing her parents and coming west with a family who needed a girl to help with their children. She told him about meeting Thomas and thinking she was fortunate to find a man who wanted to marry her despite her lack of family or dowry. She spoke honestly about her marriage, about the kindness and the comfort, but also the loneliness of sharing a life with someone who treated her more like a responsibility than a partner. "He was a good man," Gwendolyn said one afternoon as they rested in the shade of the barn, drinking cool water from the well. "But I do not think he ever really saw me, not as a person in my own right. I was his wife, the woman who kept his house and cooked his meals, but I do not think he ever wondered what I wanted or dreamed about." "What do you dream about?" Xavier asked, and the question was so direct and unexpected that Gwendolyn found herself answering honestly. "I dream about making this farm thrive," she said. "About proving to everyone in town who whispered that I should sell out and move back east that a woman can work this land as well as any man. I dream about being successful enough that I can help other women who find themselves alone and struggling. And sometimes, late at night when I cannot sleep, I dream about what it might be like to have a true partner, someone who sees me as an equal and not as someone who needs to be taken care of or managed." Xavier was quiet for a long moment, and when Gwendolyn dared to look at him, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You deserve all of that," he said softly. "And any man who could not see what a remarkable woman you are was a fool, kind though he may have been." The air between them seemed charged with something Gwendolyn could not quite name, and she looked away quickly, her heart beating faster than it should. She stood and brushed off her skirt, suddenly needing distance and air and a moment to collect herself. "We should get back to work," she said, and if her voice was not quite steady, Xavier was kind enough not to mention it. By the end of the week, the entire field was planted, and they stood together at the fence line looking out over the neat rows that held the promise of a future harvest. Gwendolyn felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by the reality of what they had accomplished together. What had seemed impossible just days ago was now done, and she had Xavier to thank for it. "I do not know how to repay you for this," she said, and her voice was thick with emotion. "You already have," Xavier replied. He was standing close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and Gwendolyn was acutely aware of his presence, of the warmth radiating from his body, and the way he smelled of honest sweat and sun-warmed skin. "You gave me a place to rest and food to eat and treated me like I mattered. That is more than most people offer a drifter." "You are not just a drifter," Gwendolyn said, turning to face him fully. "You are a good man, Xavier Patterson, and I am grateful that fate brought you down that road when I needed help most. Gwendolyn." He said her name like it meant something, like it was important, and then he reached out and tucked a strand of hair that had escaped her braid behind her ear. The gesture was tender and intimate, and Gwendolyn felt her entire body respond to that simple touch. "Xavier, She did not know what she meant to say, but the words died on her lips as he leaned closer, giving her every opportunity to pull away, to stop what was about to happen. But she did not want to stop it. She wanted this more than she had wanted anything in a very long time. His lips met hers softly, a question and a promise all at once. Gwendolyn's eyes fluttered closed and she leaned into the kiss, her hands coming up to rest against his chest where she could feel the steady beating of his heart. He tasted like coffee and sunshine, and when his arms came around her waist to pull her closer, she went willingly. When they finally broke apart, both breathing harder than they should, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I should move on," he said quietly. "That was what I said I would do once the planting was done. But Gwendolyn, I do not want to leave. These past days with you have meant more to me than all the miles I have traveled in the last 10 years. I know I have no right to ask, but I would like to stay. Not just to help with the farm, but because I cannot imagine riding away from you." Gwendolyn's heart felt like it might burst from her chest. Every practical instinct told her to be cautious, to protect herself, to remember that she had only known this man for a week. But a deeper instinct, one that spoke to something fundamental in her soul, told her that this was right, that Xavier was right, that this feeling between them was real and worth the risk. "Then stay," she whispered. "Stay and help me bring in the harvest. Stay and see what we can build together. Stay because I do not want you to go." Xavier kissed her again, deeper this time, with a passion that spoke of all the lonely roads he had traveled and all the empty nights she had endured. When they finally walked back to the house hand in hand, the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and gold, painting the newly planted field in colors that seemed to promise abundance and hope. That night, they sat together on the porch steps and talked until the stars came out, speaking of futures and possibilities and the tentative shape of dreams that might actually come true. Xavier told her that he had enough money saved from his years of work to contribute to the farm expenses, and he had skills beyond plowing that could be useful. He could build and repair, work with horses and cattle, hunt and trap to supplement their food supply. "I want to do this properly," Xavier said as the moon rose full and bright above them. "I want to court you the right way, let the people in town know my intentions are honorable. I want to marry you, Gwendolyn, if you will have me. Not because you need a man to help run this farm, but because I love you." The words hung in the air between them, and Gwendolyn felt tears streaming down her cheeks. "You love me. We have known each other barely a week." "I know." Xavier wiped her tears away with his thumbs, cradling her face in his hands. "It makes no logical sense, and if someone had told me a week ago that I would meet a woman and know within days that she was the one I had been searching for all my life, I would have called them crazy. But it is the truth, Gwendolyn. I love your strength and your determination. I love the way you face impossible odds without complaining. I love how you treated me with respect from the first moment, even when you had every reason to be suspicious. I love talking with you and working beside you and the way you laugh when something surprises you. I love everything about you, and I do not want to spend another day of my life without you in it. Oh, Xavier." Gwendolyn was crying in earnest now, but they were tears of joy and relief and a happiness so intense it was almost painful. "I love you too. I have been trying not to admit it to myself because it seemed too fast, too impossible, but I do. I love you, and I want you to stay, not just for the harvest but forever." They sealed their promises with another kiss, and when they finally parted to seek their separate beds, Gwendolyn, for the first time in months, felt complete, as though a piece of herself that had been missing had finally clicked into place. The next morning, Xavier hitched up Gwendolyn's wagon, and they drove together to Columbus, arriving at mid-morning when the town was busy with people going about their business. Gwendolyn was acutely aware of the stares they received, the widow and the strange man sitting close together on the wagon seat, and she held her head high as Xavier helped her down in front of the general store. Inside, Mrs. Patterson, the store owner's wife who shared Xavier's last name by pure coincidence, greeted Gwendolyn with barely concealed curiosity. Mrs. Zimmerman, We have not seen you in town for several weeks. I hope everything is well with you." "Everything is very well, thank you." Gwendolyn smiled and drew Xavier forward with a hand on his arm. "I would like to introduce Xavier Patterson. He has been helping me get my wheat planted, and he has agreed to stay on and work the farm with me." Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose significantly, and Gwendolyn could see her mind working, calculating what this meant and what gossip she could spread. Before the woman could say anything inappropriate, Xavier spoke up. "I would also like to speak with the Reverend while we are in town," he said clearly, his voice carrying to the other customers in the store. "I intend to court Mrs. Zimmerman properly, and I want to make my intentions known to the community." That announcement caused a stir of whispers, and Gwendolyn felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her hand on Xavier's arm and her spine straight. Let them talk. For the first time since Thomas died, she did not care what the gossip said about her. They purchased the supplies they needed, and then Xavier escorted Gwendolyn down the dusty Main Street to the small church, where Reverend Thompson held services every Sunday. The Reverend was a kind man in his 50s who had officiated at Thomas's funeral and had checked on Gwendolyn several times in the month since. "Mrs. Zimmerman, Mr. Patterson." The Reverend welcomed them into his modest office and listened attentively as Xavier explained the situation and his intentions. When Xavier had finished speaking, the Reverend looked between the two of them with thoughtful eyes. "You have known each other only a week?" he asked, not judgmentally but seeking understanding. "Yes, sir," Xavier confirmed. "But I have traveled this territory for 10 years and I have met countless people in that time. Never once have I felt about anyone the way I feel about Gwendolyn. I know it seems sudden, but I am 30 years old and I know my own mind. I love her, and I want to spend my life with her if she will have me and if you will agree to marry us when the time is right." Reverend Thompson turned to Gwendolyn. "And you, Mrs. Zimmerman, how do you feel about this?" "I feel the same," Gwendolyn said firmly. "I know people will say it is too soon after Thomas's passing, that I should mourn longer or be more careful. But Thomas was sick for 3 days and dead for 6 months. I have had time to grieve, and I have learned in that time what I want from my life. I want a true partner, someone who sees me as an equal. I want love, real love, not just comfort and security. Xavier is all of those things, and I will not apologize for accepting the happiness he offers." The Reverend was quiet for a moment, and then he smiled. "I think you are both very fortunate to have found each other. Life in this territory is hard enough without being alone. If you are both certain of your feelings, then I see no reason to stand in the way of your happiness. However, I would suggest a courtship period of at least 2 months before we discuss marriage. Not because I doubt your feelings, but because it will give the community time to accept the situation and avoid unnecessary scandal." 2 months is acceptable," Xavier agreed, and Gwendolyn nodded her assent. They left the Reverend's office with lighter hearts, and as they walked back to the wagon, several townspeople stopped them to offer congratulations or curious inquiries. Most seemed genuinely happy for Gwendolyn, though there were a few pinched expressions from the more judgmental members of the community. At the bank, they stopped so Gwendolyn could check on her mortgage payment schedule, and she was relieved to confirm that if her wheat crop came in successfully, she would have enough to make the payment and have a little left over for the winter. The bank manager, Mr. Stevens, looked over Xavier with assessing eyes. "So you are the fellow who is helping Mrs. Zimmerman with her farm," he said, his tone neutral but his expression skeptical. "I am, sir." Xavier met the man's gaze steadily. "And I intend to do everything in my power to ensure that this farm succeeds and that Mrs. Zimmerman's mortgage is paid in full and on time. See that you do." Mr. Stevens turned back to his papers, effectively dismissing them. Outside, Gwendolyn let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "He thinks you are after my land." "Let him think what he wants," Xavier said. "We know the truth, and that is all that matters. Besides, once we are married and the farm is prospering, he will change his tune quickly enough." They drove back to the farm in comfortable silence, both content to be in each other's company. When they arrived home, Xavier insisted on unhitching the wagon and tending to the horse while Gwendolyn started on supper. It was a division of labor that felt natural, both of them contributing according to their abilities and preferences, rather than rigid rules about what was men's work or women's work. Over the following weeks, they settled into a routine that felt like the foundation of a real life together. Xavier proved to be as versatile as he had claimed, repairing the sagging porch rail and the leak in the barn roof, building a better chicken coop that kept the fox from getting at the hens, and a dozen other tasks that Gwendolyn had been putting off because she lacked the skills or strength to manage them alone. They worked together in the garden, weeding and watering the vegetables that would feed them through the summer and into the fall. Xavier showed Gwendolyn how to preserve meat by smoking it, and she taught him her mother's recipe for bread that rose light and perfect every time. In the evenings, they sat together on the porch and talked about everything under the sun, their conversations ranging from the practical matters of farm management to philosophy and dreams, and the kind of life they wanted to build together. Xavier was always respectful of propriety, sleeping in the barn and never pushing for more than Gwendolyn was comfortable giving. But their physical affection grew naturally as their emotional connection deepened. He would take her hand as they walked the fence line checking for breaks, or she would lean against his shoulder as they sat watching the sunset. Their kisses became more frequent and more passionate, though they always stopped before things went too far, saving that final intimacy for their wedding night. One evening about 6 weeks after Xavier had first arrived, they were sitting on the porch watching the wheat growing green in the field when Gwendolyn turned to him with a serious expression. "Xavier, there is something I need to tell you about my marriage to Thomas." She had been thinking about this for days, knowing she needed to be honest with him before they went any further. "You do not have to tell me anything you do not want to," Xavier said gently, but Gwendolyn shook her head. "I want you to understand why this, what we have together, is so important to me." She took a deep breath. "Thomas was kind to me, but our marriage was never a love match, not really. He needed a wife to cook and clean and help with the farm, and I needed security and a home. We were comfortable together, but there was never any passion. In 3 years of marriage, I never once felt the way I feel when you kiss me. He never made my heart race or made me laugh until my sides hurt. Being with him was pleasant, but being with you is alive." Xavier pulled her close, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "I am glad you told me, but Gwendolyn, you do not need to explain or justify your past to me. Whatever your marriage was or was not, it brought you here, and that is what matters. What we have together is ours alone, and it does not need to be compared to anything that came before. I just wanted you to know," Gwendolyn whispered, "that you are not competing with a ghost. Thomas was a good man, and I am sorry he died, but I am not mourning a great lost love. I am moving forward toward something better, something real." "We both are," Xavier said, and kissed her temples softly. As the weeks passed and summer deepened into late July, the wheat grew tall and golden, rippling in waves when the wind blew across the field. Gwendolyn had never seen a crop look so promising, and Xavier assured her that if the weather held and no disasters struck, they would have an excellent harvest. The 2 months that Reverend Thompson had suggested for their courtship were nearly up, and one evening, Xavier went into town alone and returned with a small box in his pocket. That night, after supper was cleaned up and they were sitting on the porch in the gathering dusk, he got down on one knee in front of Gwendolyn and opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond set in it. "Gwendolyn Zimmerman, you are the strongest, bravest, most remarkable woman I have ever known," Xavier said, his voice rough with emotion. "You took a chance on a stranger when you had every reason to send me on my way. You have shown me what it means to truly partner with someone, to share not just the work but the dreams and the hopes and the fears. I love you more than I knew it was possible to love another person, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you every single day. Will you marry me?" Gwendolyn was crying again, but this time there was no surprise, only joy. "Yes," she said, pulling him up and into her arms. "Yes, Xavier, I will marry you. I love you so much." He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly, catching the last rays of the setting sun. They held each other close, both overwhelmed by the certainty that they had found something rare and precious, the kind of love that most people searched for their entire lives without ever finding. The next Sunday, they went to church together in Columbus, and Reverend Thompson announced their engagement to the congregation. There were some murmurs of surprise that it had happened so quickly, but most people seemed genuinely happy for them. After the service, several of the farm wives approached Gwendolyn to offer their congratulations and their help with planning a wedding. Mrs. Henderson, whose husband ran the largest ranch in the area, took Gwendolyn's hands in hers and said, "I think it is wonderful that you have found happiness again, dear. Life is too short and too hard to spend it alone when you have a chance at love." The wedding was set for the first Saturday in September, after the harvest was in and before the weather turned cold. It would be a simple affair, held at the church with a reception afterward at the farm for anyone who wanted to come. Gwendolyn did not have family to invite, and Xavier's mother had died 2 years previous from pneumonia, news that he had learned from a letter that finally caught up with him in his wanderings. But they would have friends from town and neighbors from the surrounding farms, people who had watched Gwendolyn struggle through her widowhood and were glad to see her finding happiness again. The wheat harvest came at the end of August, and it was everything they had hoped for and more. Xavier hired 3 men from town to help with the cutting and bundling, and they worked from sunup to sundown for 5 days straight, bringing in the grain and storing it safely in the barn. When the last bundle was stacked and the field stood bare, Gwendolyn walked out into the stubble with Xavier and looked at what they had accomplished together. "We did it," she said, her voice full of wonder. "We actually did it." "You did it," Xavier corrected. "This is your farm, your dream." "I just helped." "No." Gwendolyn turned to face him, taking both his hands in hers. "We did it together as partners, as equals. That is what makes it special. This is not my farm anymore, Xavier. It is our farm, our dream, our future." The next week, they took the wheat to the grain elevator in Columbus and received a price that was better than Gwendolyn had dared to hope. After paying off the mortgage and settling accounts at the general store, they had enough money left over to buy supplies for the winter, purchase a bull to breed with their cow so they could start a small herd, and even put a little away in the bank for emergencies. Mr. Stevens at the bank was significantly more pleasant when Xavier deposited their savings, actually smiling and congratulating them on their successful season. "It seems you have done well for yourself, Mrs. Zimmerman," he said. "I admit I had my doubts, but you have proved me wrong." "We have done well," Gwendolyn corrected him firmly. "And soon it will be Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, so you might as well start getting used to calling me by my new name." The days leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Gwendolyn sewed herself a new dress from fabric that Xavier insisted on buying for her, a soft blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes. Xavier purchased a new suit and had his hair trimmed by the barber in town, and they both scrubbed the house and yard until everything shone. On the morning of the wedding, Gwendolyn woke before dawn, too excited and nervous to sleep. She bathed in the copper tub that she had filled with water heated on the stove, and she washed her hair with the lavender soap she had been saving for a special occasion. By the time the sun was fully up, she was dressed and ready, her hair pinned up in a style that was more elaborate than her usual practical braid. Xavier had spent the night before at the boarding house in town, observing the tradition that the groom should not see the bride on the wedding day until the ceremony. Mrs. Henderson came out to the farm with her daughter Emily to help Gwendolyn with the final preparations and to drive her into town in their buggy. "You look beautiful, dear," Mrs. Henderson said warmly as Gwendolyn came down the stairs. "Xavier is a lucky man." "I am the lucky one," Gwendolyn replied. "I never thought I could be this happy." The church was full when they arrived, with people from all over the area who had come to witness the wedding. Gwendolyn was touched by the turnout, by the realization that even though she had often felt alone, she was part of a community that cared about her. Xavier was waiting at the front of the church with Reverend Thompson, and when Gwendolyn walked down the aisle on Mr. Henderson's arm, the look on Xavier's face made her feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. His eyes shone with love and pride and barely contained emotion, and when she reached his side and took his hand, she felt a sense of rightness that she had never experienced before. Reverend Thompson led them through the traditional vows, and when Xavier slipped the wedding band onto Gwendolyn's finger next to her engagement ring, his hand was steady and sure. When it came time to exchange their personal vows, Xavier spoke first. "Gwendolyn, when I rode up to your farm that day in June, I was just looking for work and a place to rest. But you gave me so much more than that. You gave me a home and a purpose and a reason to stop wandering. You taught me what it means to truly partner with someone, to share all the joys and burdens of life equally. I promise to stand beside you always, to love you and respect you, and never take for granted the gift of your presence in my life. You are my home now, wherever we are, and I will spend the rest of my days being worthy of the love you have given me." Gwendolyn had to take a moment to compose herself before she could speak, her voice thick with tears. "Xavier, you came into my life when I was at my lowest, when I thought I would have to give up everything I had worked for. But you did not just help me save my farm. You showed me what love can be when it is between two people who truly see and value each other. You never treated me like I needed to be rescued or protected or managed. You treated me like a capable person whose dreams mattered, and that gift is more precious than anything. I promise to love you with my whole heart, to be your partner in all things, and to build a life with you that honors both of our strengths. I choose you, Xavier, today and every day for the rest of our lives." When Reverend Thompson finally said, "You may kiss your bride," Xavier cupped Gwendolyn's face in his hands and kissed her with a tenderness and passion that made the entire congregation sigh. They walked back down the aisle hand in hand as husband and wife, and the joy on both their faces was radiant. The reception at the farm was a lively affair, with tables set up in the yard and food contributed by all the neighbors. There was music and dancing and toasts to the happy couple, and as the afternoon stretched into evening, Gwendolyn felt surrounded by warmth and goodwill. When the last guests had finally departed, and the sun was setting in brilliant shades of red and gold, Xavier and Gwendolyn stood together in the yard looking at their home, their land, their future. "Are you ready to begin our life together, Mrs. Patterson?" Xavier asked, pulling her close. "I have been ready since the moment you took the reins of that plow," Gwendolyn replied, tilting her face up for his kiss. That night, they finally came together as husband and wife in the bed that Gwendolyn had once shared with Thomas, but that now felt completely transformed, made new by the passion and love that she and Xavier shared. Xavier was gentle and patient, taking his time to learn what brought her pleasure, and Gwendolyn discovered that the physical side of marriage could be joyful and fulfilling when it was with someone she truly loved. Afterward, lying in Xavier's arms with her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, Gwendolyn felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. "I did not know it could be like this," she whispered. "Like what?" Xavier's hand was stroking her hair, his touch gentle and soothing. All of it. The partnership, the conversation, the physical closeness. "I thought marriage was about duty and getting through the days. I did not know it could be about joy." "We will have our share of hard days too," Xavier said realistically. "Farming is never easy, and life has a way of throwing challenges at you when you least expect them. But we will face them together, and that makes all the difference." The first year of their marriage proved Xavier right on both counts. They had their share of challenges, with an early frost that killed some of their winter wheat, and a difficult calving season with their small herd of cattle. But they also had countless moments of joy and connection, from the simple pleasure of working side by side in the garden to the excitement of going to town together and being greeted as Mr. and Mrs. Patterson. In the spring, Gwendolyn realized she was pregnant, and the news filled them both with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The pregnancy was not easy, with Gwendolyn suffering from sickness that lasted well into the 4th month and exhaustion that made even simple tasks feel overwhelming. But Xavier was unfailingly patient and supportive, taking on extra work without complaint and making sure Gwendolyn rested when she needed to. Mrs. Henderson and several of the other farm wives made a point of checking on Gwendolyn regularly, bringing food and advice, and the kind of female solidarity that she had not realized she was missing. They held a quilting bee to make blankets for the baby, and they shared their own stories of pregnancy and childbirth, preparing Gwendolyn for what was to come. The baby arrived on a cold January night in 1884, after a labor that lasted nearly 20 hours and left Gwendolyn exhausted but triumphant. Xavier stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and wiping her brow and murmuring encouragement. When the midwife finally placed the squalling infant in Gwendolyn's arms, she looked down at her son and felt a love so fierce it took her breath away. "A boy," Xavier said, his voice full of wonder as he touched the baby's tiny fist. "We have a son." They named him Thomas Xavier, honoring both the past and the present. Little Tommy, as they called him, had his father's dark hair and his mother's determined chin, and from the beginning he showed a personality that was all his own, curious and alert and quick to smile. Being parents brought new challenges and new joys to their lives. There were sleepless nights and endless diapers, and the constant low-level worry that came with being responsible for such a small, helpless creature. But there was also the miracle of watching Tommy grow and change, learning to hold up his head and roll over and eventually to crawl and pull himself up on the furniture. The farm prospered as well, with each year bringing better yields and allowing them to expand their operation gradually. They added more cattle and pigs, built a larger barn, and eventually saved enough to purchase an additional 40 acres adjacent to their original property. Xavier proved to be not just a hard worker, but a shrewd businessman, always thinking ahead about how to improve their efficiency and increase their profits. When Tommy was 2 years old, Gwendolyn became pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was easier, her body more accustomed to the changes and demands. Their daughter was born on a warm June day in 1886, arriving so quickly that Xavier barely had time to fetch the midwife. They named her Clara Grace, and she had her mother's blonde hair and her father's blue eyes, a perfect combination that made everyone who saw her smile. With 2 young children and a growing farm, their lives were full to bursting, but Gwendolyn would not have changed a single thing. She loved the chaos and the noise and the constant activity, so different from the lonely silence of her widowhood. She loved watching Xavier with their children, seeing his patience and gentleness, and the way he made them laugh with his silly games and stories. One evening when Tommy was 4 and Clara was 2, they were all sitting on the porch after supper, watching the sun set over their fields. Tommy was playing with a wooden horse that Xavier had carved for him, and Clara was drowsing in Gwendolyn's lap, her thumb in her mouth. "Do you ever think about that first day?" Gwendolyn asked Xavier, who was sitting close beside her with his arm around her shoulders. "When you rode up and found me struggling with that plow?" "I think about it all the time," Xavier replied. "I think about how close I came to just riding past, to thinking it was not my business to interfere. I almost did, you know. I almost convinced myself that you would not want help from a stranger. But you stopped anyway." Gwendolyn leaned her head against his shoulder. "You stopped and offered help, and you changed both our lives." "We changed each other's lives," Xavier corrected. "You gave me a home and a purpose when I had spent 10 years drifting. You showed me what it means to have roots and connections and something worth staying for. Everything good in my life now came from that decision to stop and help a woman who was too stubborn to give up." "I was not stubborn," Gwendolyn protested, laughing. "I was determined." "You were both," Xavier said, kissing her temple. "And I loved you for it from the very first day, even though I did not realize it yet." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, their children safe and content, their farm thriving, their love as strong as it had been the day they married. Gwendolyn thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the desperate widow struggling to survive to the contented wife and mother who had everything she had ever dreamed of and more. As the years continued to pass, their family and their farm both continued to grow. They had a third child, another son they named William, who arrived when Tommy was 7 and Clara was 5. Will, as they called him, was the most adventurous of their children, always getting into things and keeping his parents on their toes. Tommy grew into a serious, responsible boy who loved working alongside his father in the fields and learning everything there was to know about farming. Clara was artistic and thoughtful, spending hours drawing pictures and making up stories. Will was the charmer, able to talk his way out of trouble with a grin and a well-timed joke. Gwendolyn and Xavier faced the normal trials of raising children and running a farm, from childhood illnesses that had them up all night with worry to crop failures that threatened their financial security. But they faced everything together, their partnership as strong as ever, and their love deepening with each passing year. They also faced the changes that were transforming the West, as more settlers arrived and the wild frontier gradually became more civilized. Columbus grew from a small settlement into a proper town with a school and a doctor and even a newspaper. The railroad came through in 1889, bringing new opportunities for shipping their grain and cattle to markets back east. Xavier became respected in the community, serving on the town council and helping to mediate disputes between neighbors. Gwendolyn joined the Ladies' Aid Society and helped organize fundraisers for the new school. They were no longer the widow struggling alone and the drifter looking for work. They were the Pattersons, a family that had built something lasting and valuable through hard work and determination and love. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1893, Xavier surprised Gwendolyn by taking her on a trip to Billings, the nearest big city. They left the children with Mrs. Henderson, who was delighted to dote on them for a few days, and they stayed in a real hotel with indoor plumbing and electric lights. "This is so fancy," Gwendolyn said, looking around their hotel room with wide eyes. "I feel like we should not be touching anything for fear of breaking it." "We have earned a little luxury," Xavier said, pulling her into his arms. "We have worked hard for 10 years, and I wanted to do something special to celebrate." That night, they had dinner in the hotel restaurant, and Xavier gave her a gift, a beautiful cameo necklace that had belonged to his mother. "She would have loved you," he said as he fastened it around Gwendolyn's neck. "She would have been so proud to see what we have built together." "I wish I could have known her," Gwendolyn said, touching the cameo with gentle fingers. "I will treasure this always." They spent 3 days in Billings, taking walks through the city streets, attending a theatrical performance at the Opera House, and simply enjoying being alone together without the constant demands of farm and children. It was wonderful, but by the end of the 3rd day, they were both ready to go home, missing their children and their life. The ride back to Columbus seemed shorter than the trip out had been, and when they pulled up to the farm and saw Tommy, Clara, and Will come running out to greet them, Gwendolyn felt her heart swell with happiness. This was where she belonged, surrounded by the people she loved and the land they had worked so hard to tame. As their children grew into teenagers and then young adults, Gwendolyn and Xavier watched with pride as they each found their own paths. Tommy took over more and more of the farm work, proving himself to be as capable and hardworking as his father. At 20, he married a sweet girl from town named Elizabeth, and they built a house on the far corner of the property, planning to eventually take over the farm when Xavier was ready to step back. Clara went away to teachers' college, something that would have been impossible without the prosperity the farm had achieved, and she returned to Columbus to teach at the school they had helped build. She married a young lawyer named David, who had moved to town from St. Louis, and they settled in Columbus, close enough to visit regularly. Will, true to his adventurous nature, decided farming was not for him and headed to Oregon to seek his fortune in the timber industry. It was hard for Gwendolyn to see him go, but she understood that he needed to find his own way, just as Xavier had once wandered before finding his home. By the time Gwendolyn and Xavier reached their 50s, they had 5 grandchildren between Tommy and Clara, with Will writing to say he had gotten married and had a baby girl on the way. The farm was more prosperous than ever, with Tommy managing most of the day-to-day operations and Xavier focusing on the business side and passing on his accumulated wisdom to his son. Gwendolyn had slowed down a bit, her joints aching more than they used to, but she still kept an extensive garden and spent her days cooking for the extended family that gathered around her table every Sunday after church. She had become the matriarch she had never thought she would be, the center of a large, loving family that had grown from that single moment when a drifter had stopped to help a widow with her plow. One evening in the summer of 1908, Gwendolyn and Xavier sat together on the porch, watching the sunset just as they had done countless times over the years. They were in their 60s now, their hair gray and their faces lined, but the love between them was as strong as ever. "Do you have any regrets?" Gwendolyn asked, taking Xavier's hand in hers. "Not a single one," Xavier replied without hesitation. Every choice I made led me to you, and you have given me a life beyond anything I ever dreamed was possible. I have a family, a home, a purpose. I have known what it means to love and be loved. What more could any man ask for? I feel the same, Gwendolyn said softly. When Thomas died, I thought my life was over. I thought I would struggle alone until I lost the farm, and then I would fade away into nothing. But then you came along and showed me that life could be full of joy and purpose and partnership. You gave me everything I never knew I wanted. We gave it to each other, Xavier corrected, just as he always did. Neither of us would have this life without the other. They sat together in the gathering darkness, holding hands and watching the stars come out over the land they had worked so hard to build into something lasting. Behind them, the house was full of light and warmth, with Tommy and Elizabeth and their children visiting for supper. In town, Clara was probably putting her own children to bed while David read the evening newspaper. And far away in Oregon, Will was building his own life and his own family. All of it, Gwendolyn thought, had started with a broken plow and a stranger who stopped to help. All of it had grown from a widow's determination and a drifter's willingness to put down roots. All of it was built on the foundation of real love, the kind that saw each partner as an equal and valued their dreams as much as your own. I love you, Xavier Patterson, Gwendolyn said, squeezing his hand. I love you, Gwendolyn Patterson, Xavier replied, bringing her hand to his lips for a kiss. Forever and always. The years continued to pass in the gentle rhythm of a life well lived, with seasons of planting and harvest, of births and deaths, of challenges met and overcome. Xavier and Gwendolyn grew old together, their steps slower but their hearts still intertwined, their love a constant in a changing world. When Xavier passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 72, having lived a full and happy life, Gwendolyn mourned him deeply, but without regret. They had been blessed with nearly 30 years of marriage, 3 children, and a growing brood of grandchildren. They had built a legacy that would last for generations, not just in the prosperous farm that Tommy now ran, but in the example they had set of what marriage and partnership could be when it was based on mutual respect and genuine love. Gwendolyn lived another 5 years after Xavier's death, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, content in the knowledge that she had lived a life full of meaning and love. When she finally closed her eyes for the last time at the age of 76, it was in the bed she had shared with Xavier, in the house they had made together, on the land that had brought them together all those years ago. She was buried beside Xavier in the cemetery overlooking Columbus, and at her funeral, the church was packed with family and friends and people whose lives they had touched over the decades. Tommy gave the eulogy, speaking through tears about parents who had shown him what it meant to be a good person and a loving partner. My father was a drifter when he met my mother, Tommy said, his voice carrying through the hushed church. And my mother was a widow struggling to survive alone. They could have been just another sad story of the hard times in the West. But instead they chose each other, and they built something beautiful. They showed all of us that love is not about grand gestures or perfect circumstances. It is about showing up every day and doing the work together. It is about seeing your partner as an equal and valuing their dreams as much as your own. It is about staying, even when things get hard. My father took the reins of my mother's plow that first day, and he stayed. And in staying, he showed us all what it means to truly love someone. Long after both Gwendolyn and Xavier were gone, their story lived on in the family they had created and the land they had built together. The farm remained in the Patterson family for generations, with each new child hearing the story of how their great-great-grandparents had met and fallen in love in a matter of days, building a marriage that had lasted through decades and left a legacy of love and partnership. The original farmhouse was preserved and added onto over the years, and in the front room, hanging in a place of honor, was a photograph taken on Gwendolyn and Xavier's 25th wedding anniversary. In it, they stood together in front of the barn, his arm around her waist and her head leaning against his shoulder, both of them smiling at the camera with the easy contentment of two people who had found exactly what they were looking for in each other. And if you looked closely at the background of that photograph, you could just make out the field where it had all begun. The field that Gwendolyn had been plowing alone on that hot June day in 1882, when a stranger on a paint horse had ridden up and offered to help. The field where a widow and a cowboy had found each other and built a love story that would last forever.